Welcome back, everybody, to another deep dive. And today we're going to be looking at a discourse by Osho. This one is all about, well, we're calling it truth, enlightenment, and sainthood.
Hmm.
Does that sound about right?
Yeah. It's a good way to put it.
Okay, great. And so the discourse starts off with a really interesting question. It asks, can everyone become a saint?
Right. Is enlightenment only for a select few, or is it a possibility for, everyone?
Yeah, and that's a very bold claim. I mean, if we all have this saintly potential, then, what is holding us back?
Well, Osho, he uses this great analogy of a seed.
Okay.
He says each seed, has the inherent capacity to become like a magnificent tree.
Right.
But you need the right conditions to flourish.
Right.
Like good soil, water, sunlight. And so in the same way, humans need the right environment and nourishment to reach their full potential. Spiritually, that is.
Okay, so I really like that analogy. So it's like, instead of thinking of sainthood as this mystical, unattainable state reserved for a chosen few, we should be asking what kind of soil or sunlight we need to cultivate that potential within ourselves.
Right.
What else does he say about this idea of sainthood?
Well, Osho really challenges that whole exclusive club idea of sainthood.
Yeah.
He suggests that people who push that narrative often do so just to kind of inflate their own egos and create this hierarchy that separates the enlightened from the ordinary.
Right. So maybe the first hurdle on the path to sainthood is recognizing that we're all starting from the same point. That seed of potential exists within all of us.
Right.
But if we think we're already there, we might miss the entire point.
Yeah, exactly.
Let's shift gears a bit now and talk about truth, which Osho uses the term satya. And something that I found really interesting about this concept was that truth isn't something you gradually acquire. It's a total transformation, a complete shift in, how we perceive reality. It's not like collecting pieces of a puzzle.
Right.
And then eventually seeing the full picture.
Yeah. Osho actually compares it to climbing stairs to a rooftop.
Yeah.
You take each step one by one. But you only actually reach the roof, with that final step.
Oh.
So the journey might be gradual, but the realization itself is sudden and complete.
So is it kind of like those aha moments where suddenly everything clicks into place?
Right, exactly.
You've been working towards something and then boom, it hits you all at once.
Yeah. And that brings us to another really interesting point that Osho makes about language.
Okay.
He argues that the language that we use for everyday communication is just not equipped to express the experience of truth.
Yeah, I can see that. How do you even put that into words?
Right.
It's like trying to describe the taste of chocolate to someone who's never had it. They can imagine it, but until they actually taste it for themselves, they won't truly understand.
Exactly. And Osho shares this really interesting anecdote about a sage. Whenever he was asked about truth, he just responded with silence. And it wasn't that he was refusing to answer. It was more like, silence is the most accurate way to convey the essence of truth.
Silence is the language of truth. That's powerful.
Yeah.
So I guess it speaks to the idea that truth is something to be experienced, not just debated or intellectually grasped.
Right.
Now, speaking of experience, something I was thinking about when I was reading this discourse was the role of karma. If our present lives are shaped by past actions, choices we made in previous lives, does that mean that free will is just an illusion?
That's a question a lot of people have when they start exploring these ideas.
Yeah.
If everything is predetermined by our past karma, then do we even have control over our own destiny?
Right. I mean, it seems like a bit of a paradox, to strive for spiritual growth if we're already bound by past actions. What does Osho have to say about this?
Well, Osho's perspective on this is actually pretty nuanced.
Yeah.
He says that humans aren't simply puppets, controlled by past actions.
Yeah.
But we're also not completely free agents. We exist in this dynamic interplay between our past conditioning and our present choices.
Okay, so it's not one or the other, fate or free will.
Right.
But this constant back and forth
Right.
between the influences of our past and the power of our choices in the present.
Exactly.
Yeah.
He uses this analogy that's attributed to Hazrat Ali, where Ali was asked whether humans are free or predetermined. And he instructed the questioner to lift one leg, then the other. And the first leg could be lifted freely, but the second remained bound.
I like that. So it's like one foot might be rooted in our past, influenced by karmic patterns.
Right.
But with the other foot, we have the freedom to step in a new direction, to break free from those old habits. So we're not completely off the hook.
Right.
Our past choices do have consequences, but we're not powerless either. We always have that capacity to choose differently, to step towards a new way of being.
Exactly. Osho's saying that even though the pull of past habits, that karmic weight, might create resistance, we can still choose to move in a new direction.
Hmm.
But that kind of brings up another question, right? Like, how do we actually do that? How do we break free from those ingrained patterns and create a new path for ourselves?
Right. Well, one of the key practices that Osho emphasizes is this idea of becoming a witness, which he calls sakshi.
Okay.
It's about cultivating a state of detached observation. So watching our thoughts and experiences unfold without judgment or attachment.
So it's like stepping back from the stage of our mind
Hmm.
and becoming an observer in the audience.
Right.
Instead of getting caught up in all the drama of our thoughts and emotions,
Yeah,
we create this space to simply watch them play out.
exactly. And he uses this really, really great analogy. He talks about watching a flower.
When we just observe the flower, we're in this state of pure witnessing. But the moment we start thinking, oh, this flower is beautiful, or I've seen this flower before,
Yeah,
the mind steps in
yeah.
and we lose that direct experience.
We start adding all these layers of interpretation and judgment and memories and associations on top of that pure experience of simply seeing the flower.
Right. Exactly.
It becomes less about the flower itself and more about our mental chatter about the flower.
Exactly. And this is where the practice of witnessing comes in. It's about learning to recognize those thought patterns, to observe them without getting, swept away,
Yeah.
and to create a space between ourselves and that constant mental noise.
Okay, so we're not trying to stop our thoughts or emotions. We're just trying to become more aware of them, to observe them without judgment, and to create some distance between ourselves and that mental chatter.
Right.
That's really interesting. So what happens when we get good at this witnessing thing? Like what's the end goal here?
Well, through consistent practice, Osho says we can reach a state of nirvichar.
Nirvichar.
Yeah, a state of thoughtlessness.
Okay.
But it's not about becoming empty-minded. It's about achieving this heightened state of awareness
Okay.
where, we're fully present in the moment without the constant noise of the thinking mind.
Can you give me like a sense of what that might feel like?
Hmm.
Because I think a lot of people, myself included, probably struggle to even imagine like what a state of thoughtlessness would actually feel like.
Sure. I mean, think of those rare moments where you're completely absorbed in something.
Okay.
Maybe you're listening to music that moves you deeply, or you're lost in the beauty of a natural landscape. In those moments, your worries, your thoughts, they just kind of fade away. You're completely present. You're fully immersed in the experience itself.
Yeah.
And that's a taste of what nirvichar can feel like.
So it's not about like erasing our thoughts completely. It's
Right.
about shifting our relationship with them, becoming the observer rather than getting lost in the storyline. That makes a lot of sense. It sounds peaceful, but I imagine it takes a lot of dedication and discipline to quiet that inner critic and cultivate that kind of stillness. And honestly, I think a lot of us crave those quick fix solutions,
Right.
especially when it comes to something as complex as like spiritual growth.
Yeah, it's understandable. We live in a world that prizes speed and efficiency. So it's natural to want a shortcut on the spiritual path as well.
Mm.
But Osho, he cautions against falling for those spiritual traps.
What kind of traps?
He's talking about those who promise enlightenment through mere rituals or blind faith, or by surrendering to a guru's grace, like outsource your spiritual growth kind of schemes.
So it's not enough to just go through the motions or put our faith in some external authority.
Right.
Like real transformation, real growth requires us to roll up our sleeves and do the inner work. Yeah.
Exactly. Osho stresses that true transformation requires effort, self-discipline, and a willingness to face those parts of ourselves that we might rather avoid.
Yeah.
It's not always easy or comfortable,
Mm.
but it's the only path to genuine liberation.
So there's no bypassing the work part of this work.
Right.
Even if we have a teacher or guide, we can't just sit back and wait for enlightenment to be bestowed upon us. We have to actively participate in our own transformation. And this all kind of seems to tie back to the idea of the ego that we were talking about earlier.
Yes. Osho describes the ego, or ahankar, as a state of ignorance,
Okay.
a misidentification with this limited sense of self. It's not a force to be fought against,
Okay.
but rather, a misunderstanding that needs to be transcended.
So the ego isn't some inherently bad entity that needs to be eradicated.
Right?
It's more like a case of mistaken identity. Like, we've convinced ourselves that we are this limited, separate self, when in reality there's something much greater at play.
Yeah.
Exactly. And that brings us back to this powerful analogy that Osho uses, uh, the salt doll dissolving in the ocean.
Oh, yeah.
So the doll represents the ego,
Okay.
this limited, separate sense of self. And as it merges with the vastness of the ocean, which symbolizes cosmic consciousness, it loses its individual form and becomes part of something much greater.
Wow. I love that. But what does that actually mean for someone who's trying to live a more fulfilling life? What does dissolving the ego actually look like in practice?
Well, it doesn't mean that we become emotionless or indifferent to the world. It's about recognizing that our true essence isn't bound by those limitations. We can experience anger, sadness, joy,
Right.
but we don't have to let those emotions define us or control our actions.
It's like we're shifting from I am angry to I am experiencing anger.
Right.
Like, it's a subtle but powerful distinction. We're acknowledging the emotion without letting it take over the steering wheel. So in essence, dissolving the ego is about recognizing our interconnectedness with everything, seeing ourselves as part of something much larger than this limited sense of me.
Exactly. And in that recognition, we find a profound sense of unity, belonging, and liberation from the suffering that arises from our sense of separation.
But I think it's important to acknowledge that this whole idea of like merging with a greater reality can sound pretty daunting. It's like stepping off a cliff into the unknown. Is there something inherently scary about dissolving the ego?
It's understandable to feel that way.
Yeah.
I mean, after all, the ego is designed to protect us,
Yeah.
to keep us feeling safe and in control.
Yeah.
But that same ego can also become a prison, keeping us trapped in fear, limitation, and separation.
So it's like the ego is both the bars of the cage and the key to unlocking the door. We need to understand how it operates so that we can use its energy wisely without letting it run the show.
That's a great way to put it. And Osho, he reminds us that this journey isn't about seeking some external reward or validation. It's about discovering the truth of our own being, a truth that already exists within us. It's not about becoming someone else, but about uncovering who we truly are.
And that kind of brings us back to this concept of sainthood that we were talking about at the beginning. Is that what it means to become a saint, to dissolve the ego and merge with a greater reality?
Well, Osho's view of sainthood is really radical. He challenges that traditional image of the saint as someone who's renounced the world and dedicated himself to a life of austerity.
So it's not about living in a cave or wearing robes. It's about something more fundamental, something that transcends outward appearances. It's an inner state, not an outward label.
Exactly. Osho is suggesting that true sainthood lies in recognizing that we are all expressions of the same cosmic consciousness. It's about awakening to that inner light, that spark of divinity that resides within every being.
So sainthood isn't reserved for a select few. It's about tapping into that universal potential that exists within all of us.
Exactly.
We're all saint material, so to speak.
Exactly. And that awakening isn't dependent on external factors like social status, religious affiliation, or even moral behavior in the conventional sense. It's about a fundamental shift in consciousness, a recognition of our interconnectedness with everything.
Okay, so it's not about striving to be good or adhering to some rigid set of rules. It's about cultivating that inner awareness, that sense of unity with all beings. And I think this is where Osho's message really starts to resonate with me. It's not about escaping the world, but about bringing those qualities of awareness, of love, of compassion into the messiness of our everyday lives.
That's exactly it. It's about integrating those spiritual insights into our relationships, our work, our interactions with the world around us. It's about finding that balance between inner stillness and outer engagement, between cultivating a deep connection to our true nature and expressing that truth in our actions.
That's beautiful. It's like bridging that gap between spiritual practice and everyday life. But how do we actually do that? How do we take these profound concepts and translate them into something tangible, something that can make a real difference in our lives?
Yeah, so how do we do that? How do we take all these profound concepts, and how do we actually use them in our lives? How do we translate it into something real?
Yeah, that's the question, right? That's what everyone wants to know. And that's where a lot of spiritual teachings, I think, fall short. They can be very abstract. But Osho is really clear that spirituality isn't about escaping the world
Right.
or living in this kind of detached, blissful bubble. It's about bringing those qualities,
Yeah.
of awareness and love and compassion into the messiness of our everyday experiences.
Hmm. So it's not about becoming some emotionless robot or
Mhm.
retreating to a cave. It's about finding a way to integrate those spiritual insights into our relationships, our work, our interactions with the world around us.
Exactly.
It's almost like bringing the sacred into the mundane. Exactly. And one of the most powerful tools for doing that, according to Osho, is the practice of mindfulness.
Mindfulness has become such a buzzword these days.
Right.
Everyone's talking about it.
Right.
But I'm curious to hear how does Osho approach mindfulness?
Well, Osho's approach to mindfulness goes beyond simply paying attention to the present moment.
Okay.
It's about bringing a quality of non-judgmental awareness to every aspect of our lives.
So it's not just about noticing our breath or the sensations in our body. It's about uh, extending that awareness to our thoughts, our emotions, our actions, and even our interactions with others.
Right.
It's like turning up the volume on our awareness,
Mm.
tuning into the full spectrum of our experience.
Precisely. It's about becoming a conscious participant in our own lives,
Yeah,
rather than just going through the motions on autopilot
right.
or getting swept away by unconscious patterns.
I can see how that could be really transformative. Like, instead of being a passenger in our own lives, we become the driver, making conscious choices and shaping our experiences with more intention. But let's be honest,
Yeah.
it's easy to talk about mindfulness, but actually doing it,
Yeah.
in the midst of our busy, often chaotic lives, it's a whole other challenge.
Yeah. Yeah. It definitely takes practice. But even small moments of mindfulness can have like a ripple effect.
Yeah.
It's about finding those pauses throughout the day,
Yeah.
moments where we can step back from the whirlwind of activity
Yeah.
and simply observe what's happening within and around us.
So it's not about adding another item to our to-do list.
Right.
It's about finding those pockets of stillness within the flow of our day. Maybe while we're, waiting in line at the grocery store or washing the dishes,
Right.
or even just taking a few deep breaths before a meeting.
Exactly. And as we get more comfortable with this practice, those moments of mindfulness will naturally start to expand. It's like we're training our awareness muscle, building our capacity for presence and clarity.
Yeah. I love that analogy, the awareness muscle.
Yeah.
Because like any muscle, it gets stronger with use.
Right.
And as it gets stronger, we're less likely to get kind of thrown off balance by life's inevitable challenges.
Exactly. We become more grounded, more resilient, more able to navigate those ups and downs with a sense of, grace and equanimity.
That's what I find so appealing about this whole idea of mindfulness, is that potential for approaching challenges with more grace and ease. Because let's face it, life is full of curveballs.
Right.
Things don't always go our way. And it's easy to get caught up in the drama of it all, to let those external circumstances dictate our inner stance.
It's so true. But Osho reminds us that our true nature is one of peace, of, joy, of unwavering awareness. And when we connect to that inner stillness, we find that we're no longer at the mercy of those external circumstances.
So it's not about pretending that the challenges don't exist. It's about finding that inner anchor,
Right.
that source of stability within us that allows us to weather the storms of life with more resilience and peace.
Exactly. And this inner stability isn't about becoming emotionless or indifferent. It's about being able to experience the full range of human emotions. Joy, sadness, anger, love,
Right.
without getting swept away by them.
Yeah, it's that observer perspective that we were talking about earlier, that ability to witness our emotions without letting them take over the steering wheel.
Exactly. And as we cultivate that inner spaciousness, we find that we can hold all of it. The complexities of life, the joys and sorrows, the triumphs and setbacks, with more compassion and understanding, not just for ourselves, but for everyone around us.
This has been such a fascinating deep dive. We've explored so many really powerful ideas, from the nature of truth and the illusion of the ego to the practice of witnessing and the potential for sainthood within us all.
It's been a pleasure.
And to all of you listening out there, we hope this deep dive has sparked some new insights, maybe inspired you to continue exploring these concepts in your own life. The journey continues both within and all around you. So keep diving deep, keep seeking, and keep awakening to the truth of who you are. Until next time.
Please like, share and subscribe.